My name is Richard Stout, and today is October 26th. And what we are doing here is enlarging a bit on the short talk I gave for the CASETA convention in April of 2010 here in Houston. I had 35 minutes for much too much information, and we decided that it would be worthwhile while the information was still floating around in my head and with my notes to make a digital presentation just for the record. I should say now that all of this is from either personal observation or interviews with people, and looking at some monographs that have been written about some of these people since, and is not by any means in depth, but intended to give something of a sense of the fabric that existed in Houston in the 50s and 60s, those two decades, but with a look backwards to those things that sort of generated this particularly interesting period of the generation, of the genesis of interest in art in Houston in this period of time. Arguably the most widely reproduced artist in the 40s and 50s in Texas, artists of 40s and 50s in Texas was Buck Schewitz. Buck Schewitz had a long career in Houston as an illustrator and as a draftsman. He was trained as a draftsman in New York and did, that is to say, drawings, illustrations of buildings and so on. There is a good deal of information available on Buck's work, but he was very much in everyone's eye. He was widely collected in Houston by people who were involved in the oil business, because Buck's work was shown particularly in the company company of Humboldt Oil and Refining Company publications on regular occasions. So people knew Buck's work, which was beautifully made drawings from nature, Buck was beloved by the people in Houston, artists in Houston. Houston was, at this time, a very young city and quite small. Probably in the 50s there was a population of, early 50s was population probably in the neighborhood of 700,000. It was to gain a couple of 100,000 in that decade. When I came here in 1957, it was right at 900,000 people. This period of time, and that period just immediately before the late 40s, were a period of generation of interest in the arts, in the schools of architecture first, in departments of art at all three of the universities, and at the Museum of Fine Arts, and which I will give an overview of. Probably the most significant event that happened in the visual arts in Houston in terms of institutions is the founding of the Contemporary Arts Association, which I believe was 1948, which makes it the second oldest still operating institution devoted to contemporary art in the United States after the Museum of Modern Art. The Contemporary Arts Association, as it was then known, was a volunteer group made up of artists and collectors, people who wanted to see more modern art in the city than the Museum of Fine Arts was able to show in their limited funding, their limited resources in terms of building and exhibition rooms and so on. The founders put together the institution on the Bauhaus principles of good design, quality, and outreach, together with an integration of the arts. The exhibition, from the very first exhibition, was an exhibition of Latin American art, that was simply collected from the various people who collected Latin American art in Houston, and that would have been in the late 40s. The institution members would volunteer to become exhibition coordinators, and they would put together the exhibition list. Committees would look at them, and indeed very excellent exhibitions were generated in this manner. That particular style of exhibition continued all the way through almost to the very end of the 1950s. The last 3 years of Germaine McCaggie's tenure at the Museum of Contemporary Arts Association had, in fact, members from the community, not always trustees, as in charge of an exhibition, but they worked more closely then with the first director, paid director, Germaine McCaggie. The interesting early show of the Contemporary Arts Museum, Contemporary Arts Association, occurred in 1951, which was an ambitious exhibition of the work of Vincent van Gogh. This was probably generated somewhat by John and Dominique Demenil, who were also on the board at the same time, and they had given a painting by Van Gogh to the Contemporary Arts Museum, which was later sold for when the rest of their Contemporary Arts Museum collection, small collection, was sold to for funding for the institution. That exhibition, which came with the catalog, was in the museum's building, the building that you see here, but at another site. That other site was on Dallas Street at Bagby, where currently the Houston Heritage Society offices are. This building, and I think it was 1956, just before Germaine McCaggie came, maybe 55, just before Germaine McCaggie arrived in Houston, was put on a flatbed truck and taken down Main Street to its new site, this one, next to the Prudential Building here, which I understand is to be torn down shortly, regrettably, where they had a $1 a year lease for, in perpetuity. That Vincent van Gogh show in 1951 was interesting in that some of the members of the board, Preston Fraser, Frank Deleshka, and Abigine Mears, actually spent their evenings rotating, sleeping at the museum to guard the paintings, since they had no guard. Also, they had no real air conditioning. They had some heating, but no real air conditioning, so they could have such a show in the summertime. So this show was held in the spring, a small show, but a very good show. One of the founders of the Contemporary Arts Museum was Robert Preusser. Robert Preusser was a student of McNeill Davidson, a Houstonian, a student of McNeill Davidson, who was with Emma Richardson Cherry, two of the most influential teachers in Houston in the early days in the 20s and 30s. Robert Preusser had an exhibition of his work at the Museum of Fine Arts in 1940. And at that time, he visits, together with McNeill Davidson, his teacher, with Moholy-Nagy in Chicago, who had been established there, having escaped Europe because of Hitler, established the Institute of Design at Chicago, an independent organization, later merged by 1955 into the Illinois Institute of Technology, where Mies van der Rohe taught. Moholy-Nagy, by the way, was the second exhibition held at the Contemporary Arts Museum. In 1956, and it was at that time that both in Chicago and at the Moholy-Nagy show that Robert Preusser became familiar and friendly with the other interesting European painter who was artist who was working in America at this time. His name was Jorgi Keppisch, a painter who was at MIT, and perhaps because of this, I say perhaps because I don't know for sure, But I believe perhaps because of this, an exhibition of Kepisch's paintings were held at the Museum of Fine Arts in, I believe, 1955 or 1960. I didn't see the show, but I saw a number of people who had bought work from the show, and I was given one by an elderly purchaser of that work some years back. It wasn't much after that, before I arrived in Houston in '57, that Preusser was asked to join Kepisch at MIT to assist him. Jumping ahead just a bit, William Anselone, who you will see in a moment, took architecture at MIT, studied with Kepisch, and also studied with Robert Preusser. There were a number of interesting figures, young people in the arts who were working in Houston at this time. A surprisingly large number of this young group of artists went to Rice University. Gertrude Levy, who married Howard Barnstone in 1955, went to Rice Institute, as it was then known, and University of Houston, and to the Museum of Fine Arts School. She loved the feeling of empowerment in Houston, to quote her. Her husband, Howard Barnstone, had been brought to the University of Houston by the School of Architecture at the University of Houston. I believe Howard was a graduate of Yale. Which I think at this point is a reason to digress just a moment to talk about the architects in Houston, the schools of architecture, and the schools of art that were developing at this time. Clearly, the oldest school of architecture in Houston would be that of the Rice University. Their in-house architect, William Morton Watkin, had been an associate with the founding architects of Rice University, Cram Goodhue and Ferguson out of Boston. Watkin came to Houston to teach architecture at Rice and also to design a number of the buildings in the campus, the first campus, as well as then later a number of other public buildings in Houston, the public library downtown, now the Eleanor Freed Library on Montrose was a Watkin building, and a number of quite beautiful houses in the neighborhood of the Museum of Fine Arts. The Rice University gradually added people, but not until the 50s, essentially to respond to the burgeoning growth of the city and needs, together with Watkin on the staff and no doubt a few others I don't know their names of. They hired Andy Todd. Anderson Todd was from an old Houston family and had, I believe, also gone to Yale, and was a modernist in the vein of Mies van der Rohe. There was a in-house sculptor, his name David Parsons, whose work you will see later, and also much later in the 60s, an in-house drawing teacher and painter, Charles Shorey, who teaches in the School of Architecture, teaches drawing. The University of Houston, on the other hand, was quite a separate kind of institution. It also was a private school. This was University of Houston didn't become a public institution in the university in the Texas system until I believe 1968. I think it became maybe 67, 68, I believe. But in the 50s, the University of Houston brought in a number of very bright young architects and Colin Rowe, I believe it was Colin Rowe, was here maybe a year or two before he went to the University of Texas at Austin to develop the architecture school. But in this time, Richard Lilliot came, Howard Barnstone, who I've mentioned, Burdett Keeland, and H.W. Lindstetter, all became members of the faculty. It was considered a very strong faculty and produced extremely interesting small amounts, but distinctive amounts of architecture in the city in the 50s and the 60s. The principal law firms, the principal architecture firms in the city were Lloyd, Morgan and Jones, Pierce and Pierce, McKee and Camerith, probably the largest, Wilson, Morris, Crane and Anderson. It certainly became the largest in time. Kenneth Fransheim, Goldman and Rolfe, Bailey, Swinson and Lindstetter, and Preston Bolton, who became partners with Howard Barnstone. The schools of art were also just beginning at this time. Of course, there had been at the Museum of Fine Arts a school of art. In fact, the museum evolved out of an art league, as many art museums do. But the School of Art probably got its biggest impetus from James Chilman, who was also at Rice, art historian, who was the director emeritus at the Museum of Fine Arts, so acting director of the Museum of Fine Arts in the years before the first major hired director, Lee Malone. Lee Malone came along in the mid-50s. I would say 54, Lee Malone came. But there was James Chilman, and the other important person in education at the Museum of Fine Arts was Ruth Euler. Ruth Euler, a painter, essentially gave up her career as a painter to become the director of education at the Museum of Fine Arts. It was quite a juggling job. The Museum of Fine Arts had a very, very small staff and a small operation as well. Nonetheless, the Museum of Fine Arts had classes. Almost all the people in the early part of this lecture took classes there, from McNeil Davidson and from Emma Rice Cherry and others. I'll mention this as I move along. Afterwards, the Museum of Fine Arts built its building by Mies van der Rohe. There were larger studio spaces available in the basement for a school. It was dressed out for being a school, to be a school, in the basement of the first Mies wing. And Lowell Daunt Collins was hired to be the director. This would have been in the very beginning of 1957, because that building was not really completed to be open to the public until that winter. I think were the first exhibitions that winter, the early next spring, at 58. Texas Southern University established an art program and hired an extremely interesting man, John Biggers, to put together not only the art program but the art faculty. I'll speak a little bit more about John Biggers later on. He fairly right away did hire Carol Sims, but I'll speak more about Carol a little bit later on. And then the University of Houston's founding art department founder, director was Frederick Brown, who was succeeded in fairly rapid order by Bernhard Limmel, and then finally by Dr. Peter Gunther, who came on as director of the art program at the University of Houston, and I would say 1958. No, I would say 1957 would be my guess there.